Hi
Everyone.
everyone.
Welcome to the second live stream in our series DocsGPT Live. I'm Alex, and this is Pavel. We're both founders of RC53, and we started this project, DocsGPT, a few months ago as a project to help people interact with documentation better and easier using the GPT technology. And in this live stream, we're planning to show you guys some new plugin slash extension that we made for DocsGPT, and then discuss the architecture, some diagrams of how the DocsGPT itself works, and maybe get some input from you on how much of it you understand, and maybe some questions. And finally, we will discuss open source large language models and how we are building our large language model too. Hi everyone. It's nice to see our audience and some new people here as well. If you have any questions at any point, please don't hesitate to ask anything. We'll be happy to answer. Let's wait for a few more minutes, and then we'll start with showing you the extension, which is really cool. It's basically a website extension where you can get a widget that basically does what DocsGPT does, but for your customers or for your team.
If anybody in the chat have questions, we can answer them now while we're waiting to show the plugin. Something quick, maybe, hopefully not too technical, so we don't go into much detail straight. If anybody has any ideas or suggestions also, we'll be happy to hear. So for hallucination, from our experience, what works best is probably not retraining, but providing it with some feedback data, sort of what is done in Alpaca model, how they discuss how they have done it. However, the bigger the data set for retraining, less hallucination it will be. Also, it depends a lot on the model itself. Like what we found with smaller models, usually there is more hallucination, but not always the case, to be honest.
I would also add, absolutely, it really does depend on the model. And if you can think about, our model and how it interacts with documentation, right? If it sees that documentation explicitly being mentioned or provided in its context, then it will obviously base its answer on that documentation that's provided. But sometimes there's not enough information. Maybe the information is partial, or information that's provided in context is not relevant to the question. It will also depend on how you structure your prompt. And yes, different models will listen differently to this prompt, and some might hallucinate. But yeah, it all depends on, training it and fine-tuning the models to make sure that the hallucination overall is just reduced. And we've been collecting some feedback on our platform since we have the up or download buttons, and we use it to, reinforce and make it better. And hopefully soon our model will be good enough to be published in near future. So can we add a tool to the LangChain agent which detects that the question is not explicitly mentioned in context and returns a static response instead of sending the request to LLM? Okay, so By saying AI, I understand what you mean. Well, I think here you have to think just even simpler. You don't even have to think about things like LangChain or any other tools, or just like having those agents. Just think of it as a context window, right? It's a language model. So it takes this context window, this data, and based upon this data, it provides an answer. So if, for example, the question is not explicitly mentioned in there, how would you know if it is explicitly or not explicitly mentioned? If you want, you can add an extra layer where some sort of, you create a prompt where you ask, is there any relevant information to this question? And then if you have, for example, response no, then maybe it's a no. But in general, what we try to do is to do this zero shot approach, or even approach it on a first prompt, where we expect the model to understand our requirements when we tell it explicitly that it should not answer question if there's no if there's no context. Currently on our website, DocsGPT, though, the restriction is not very strict, because a lot of people do like to interact with a model that behaves a bit more like a human. But I think what you are asking is manageable within the prompt itself. And once you do have a good enough quality of a model, it will be able to just understand it on a first attempt. But how can you avoid it on even before sending the request to LLM? I really maybe I don't know, to be honest. Maybe I don't know, some search algorithms, but then what if it's just semantic search where there's a similar word mentioned once or twice? Maybe, yeah, some ranking for search. If we can do a good ranking for search and understand if there's nothing relevant at all, then we might not send a request to LLM at all. But I don't think it's very expensive, to be honest.
No, you can try using smaller LLM for the initial search. If you're using
True.
some high cost model at the end, you can send the first one to like low cost one to determine if it is in indexes that is provided, and then that LLM can give instruction to the more high cost LLM, or if that one depends how that one is trained. But yeah.
So we have this cool diagram that we have drawn some time ago. And I wanted to show it to you to explain to you maybe what Pavel is saying. So we have the user query. Then we essentially embed the query. Then we query the vector DB, and this is where we get our documents from. And then you see at the step where we have instruct AI, you can split it up into two steps. And let's say the first step is going to be the first simpler LLM, which maybe refines the data, and then more advanced LLM, which combines it all together and gives user the output.
Should we go to plugin now, or
yeah.
maybe anybody else has some questions? We can wait.
Let me prepare my desktop, and I can show the plugin and show people how it works, how it looks, how it feels. Okay. Sure. Okay. Can everyone see me well? Am I streaming my screen correctly, Pavel?
Yes.
Okay, great. So we created this nice widget recently, which is basically a thing you can install on your website very easily, and it will provide you answers using the DocsGPT, basically. It will look like this. It will just be on the corner of your website. And then you can type here a question here, and then it will provide you a nice answer. So here's the code for it. And it's inside DocsGPT GitHub. You go down to extensions, you go to web widget, and then you go to this folder, and you have this simple structure. This index HTML is an example page where you can see it work like this. And all you need to put on your website is this little script tag. And it will basically activate the script in the bottom left absolute position. And the main code of it is here. That's the main logic. And it's very simple. All it does is a simple API request to your DocsGPT server. Currently, it's on the local host because I'm going to try and spin it up locally and show you how it works.
Anurag, we'll come back to your question after we show the plugin, so don't interrupt the flow.
Okay, let's compose up, and that's the simple command. It should work 99% of the time to launch everything you need. Just wait a few seconds, and that's it. And DocsGPT is up locally. It's using my keys, and then to connect my API, it knows my endpoint already, which is used by default. So if you're hosting it online, all you need to do is change your API endpoint. And maybe if you have some API key for encryption, if you want to add some logic in your app.py to protect it, that's the place to do it. And here's the request. So request data, it takes a few parameters. The main one is the message, so the question itself. And then it creates a post request, posts the question, gets the answer, and then it prints the answer out in our field. So let's just say hi to it. There's a nice processing animation. And then, hello, how can I assist you? So let's ask something real about DocsGPT. Let's ask it to create a mock API request for API/answer. So this is the API we're using right now, API answer, right? And this is the API request essentially. So if you want to write an extension, this is a very good question to ask. So we just ask this question generalistically, but if you want to be more specific, you can say, create a mock API request for /API/answer in Python or in Java or any other language that you think is important for your use case. So let's wait a bit until it creates a response. Might take a bit. And then widget HTML file is just the HTML file where we have everything. So if, for example, you're putting it on your website, you might change not DocsGPT, but whatever your company name, AI assistant or anything like this. Certainly, here is the example, and it actually gives us a full request method, headers, authorization, all that we actually need. And then let's ask it a question like, for example, what parameters, so those are our parameters that we pass within our request, what parameters does API answer need? So that's, I think, the simplest way to integrate our tool on your website. Some people, some communities like Rescript, the ones I know of explicitly, right? They are building their own custom widgets, but this is a simple widget where you can start from. And if you want to make it more complicated, you can do that. If you want to make it more simple, you can do this. But I think it's a cute little solution that works. So the API answer web endpoint needs the JSON, and it even provides the values and explains what each parameter here means. So if you're wondering what those things are, that's the question that answers this quite well. And yeah, can ask any other questions, and this is the default state that it has. It's a very, very simple but well-working widget. And it works both in dark and light themes. It's because my device is in a dark theme. It automatically becomes dark. But if, for example, you would have had a light theme on your device, that would have been working differently. Yes, definitely. Adding Markdown formatting would be really nice. I agree. We should also add it to DocsGPT itself. Okay, it did have some questions. Let's answer them one by one then. In my case, even if a text is explicitly mentioned in the context, in some cases, the doc search similarity search function does not return a piece of context. Okay, so interesting. So because usually it should return something, even if it's not relevant. Sometimes it returns things.
If you mean that it is stored somewhere in the indexes, but when you ask it, it doesn't return that particular part, you might try to make the number bigger of the searches it does.
The K.
Alex, how it's called? Yes, the K.
Yeah, I can show on my screen a good example of where we do the doc search in our code.
Also, it might be caused by the way the initial input document is split. So you might like try to do something with the way you ingest it, try some other ways, which variables you remove, which you don't, and how you split it into headers, because that might play a big part if like it detects headers correctly and stuff like that. The better the search will be. Like the more semantically it will split it into indexes initially, the better it will be like performing the search.
That's very true. Good split on your index is very important. So we do like LangChain, but we do ingest and have a custom ingester for a reason. And it's because a good split of your documentation is critical to the quality of your answers. But this is where you can increase your K, right? To make sure you have more snippets of information that is being used. But also, if you, it's not really FAI's problem. It's just the search on, vectors kind of issue. FAIS is just a very convenient way to store documents locally. But I'll show you a good example of how our tool works that is used for ingestion. And I would suggest maybe try using it. And it's a CLI. So we have a nice uploading function of our website. But if you do want to get a more advanced option, and if you do want to make sure that your ingestion is more comprehensive, I highly suggest that you use this. And sometimes when we work with companies and businesses who ask us to help them integrate a tool like this is what we're always using, because this is the way to achieve really, really good results. It's a CLI, it's inside your scripts folder, it's open source. And what I suggest is play around with those two numbers, mix and max tokens. It's basically a number of tokens that can be loaded in a single, let's say, chunk of your documentation at the same time. So for example, let's say you're ingesting HTML files, right? If I was ingesting it with something simpler, some simple tool, it will probably give me a lot of small little documents that might just be headings. So it might just be run the web app, but it will not ingest in the same document this part where it actually explains what it means. So by having a rule like this, it's more likely that other pieces of information are going to fall within the chunk. And I think that will actually help your use case a lot.
There should be no difference between ingesting zipped or like one big file for Markdown. However, when ingesting Markdown file, I recommend you to maybe even go deeper and look at how it parses Markdown file in the ingester, because for Markdown format, it doesn't have many explicit rules. It mostly detects heading by looking for hashtag at the beginning of the line and splits it like that. But if you compare it with RST, for example, how we process it, there are more rules and more settings already like implemented. So maybe for your use case, if it is hallucinating a lot and doesn't return the search correctly, you might need to play around with Markdown ingester itself and maybe use some additional rules. Maybe like for your use case, there are a lot of noise, which is not, for example, yeah, maybe a lot of noise, some other issues it might cause for your particular file.
Sure. And I do like his suggestion, which is to play with the Markdown ingester itself, because at the end of the day, quality really does depend on the way it is being ingested. And if you, for example, want to get links out of your responses, we are simply cutting them out a lot of the time, but you can just amend this rule to get more links in your documentation that you ingest as well. But yeah, definitely try to work with the tables. I think, sorry, try to play. I think that would be great. So next thing we also wanted to discuss quickly, to touch on, is our diagrams. So we prepared a few diagrams to help people understand how DocsGPT works, what it looks like, and wrong thing. So a simple thing is how documents are ingested. It's a simple diagram. So we have our vector database and we have our embeddings. And we store both things in VectorDB. We store the document itself and the embeddings which are related to it. So this way we can you know, ask the question, and then when the question gets asked, it looks up using the embeddings, the similarity, and then you find your value, which is the document itself. So if you have any comments on these diagrams, or you have any questions that might help you understand how it works, please ask them, because I do want them to be nice and explicit. And at the same time, I want them to be simple. I want it to be something that people can look at and understand what DocsGPT project is about. So this is our ingesting documents, and I just added architecture. So for our architecture, we have few containers that are being used when we launch the application. So if you noticed previously when I launched the DocsGPT to use it with the widget, I launched some containers, and those containers were front-end, back-end, Redis, MongoDB, and a worker. And each of them have an important use. Do we also generate embeddings for the user query? Yes, absolutely we do. And I think this is our final diagram. So we have 3 diagrams that we have created. So this is the query diagram. And here you see user query embeddings. So the user query gets embedded. Then the vector database gives us the context, provides us all of the relevant information. And then this context goes into our AI. And this step, instruct AI step, can be broken into smaller ones, and they really do depend on the strategy that you choose to interact with your documents. But it gets in your instruct AI, and then straight afterwards, you get your output. And those are the 3 graphs that I hope give people a good explanation on how our system works, and makes them understand what kind of containers get launched and what's the general architecture. And if you can see in the container diagram, our, for example, widget would be interacting with the backend container, and you can just put the widget up. It's a static thing, it doesn't really need a container. What is the use of Redis, Celery on MongoDB? Good question. So Celery is a part of worker and backend interaction. So as you see in our architecture diagram, I'll make this one smaller for a bit and this one smaller for a bit and talk about architecture. So backend and worker, they communicate using Redis with each other, using Celery, and Celery uses Redis. And for example, when you send your document, we don't want to process it on our API endpoint. We want to process it on our worker side, because if, for example, it runs for a minute or 2, it's going to be too long for a simple API request. So we need to create a background job, which is what workers are for, what Redis and Celery are for. It's just a simple way to manage background workers. This is why we have Celery and Redis. And honestly, I think in future, we might migrate some of the queries and some of the functions away from the API endpoint and into the worker. And at the end of the day, worker sends the documents to the, backend sends the documents to the worker embeds them, because sometimes embeddings can take hours. Some people have big amounts of data that they want to ingest. And that's probably the right place to do those jobs is inside the worker. MongoDB is just to store like a map. It's like for us to understand where is the location of our document and indexes that we uploaded. Indexes, they get stored in files. They get stored locally. They get stored in your file system. So if we don't need to upload documents at runtime, we can remove this, right? You can remove documents. They will be stored in your file system. And if you remove them from there, you won't be able to access them. But also those same documents will be stored in your, not the documents, but the mention of those will be stored in MongoDB. But we have a simple function in the UI that does everything. It will clean up your file system and it will clean up your MongoDB. I hope I understood your question correctly and answered it correctly. But yeah, so maybe this diagram maybe it doesn't explicitly tell what each container is being used for. Maybe it's good if this diagram does come with some comments at the bottom explaining which container is doing what and what's the purpose of each and every one of them. I think that would be a good addition. What do you think, Pavel?
Yeah, probably give people who are committing more insight to make it easier to contribute.
Yeah, I think the more complicated the application becomes, the harder it becomes for people to contribute, to be honest. And yeah, this structure is not a very simple one. Okay. Yes, the architecture diagram needs more context. I agree. The other ones I think are relatively simple. It just shows what the query is and what the ingesting documents part is doing. I think we'll upload both of them to the GitHub, but I think of making like a separate page where we explain thoroughly what everything is. I think the best explanation we currently have is in a contributing.md, but I think this will be much, much better. So another thing we wanted to talk about is open source language models. So this is the interesting part because we've been asked a lot by companies and people in terms of building the open source tool. And I think open sourcing a model is quite cool because if you do achieve that, if you do get to build an open source model, then you can ensure that data is safe. You don't need to share it with any other company, and then you can host it on your own infrastructure as well, which is a huge advantage. And if we look at the open source models which are available right now, you will probably have Llama, which is, I think, the base model for so many models that came out right now. And I've seen some good models that get like 60,000 of training, questions, answers into them. But for our use case, I think we do have a specific use case. And I don't really think GPT-4 or even GPT Turbo is the perfect options for them. I think the perfect option is going to be once we fine tune our own model, maybe on top of Llama. And in that solution, I think we have to integrate all the feedbacks that we have collected throughout the time. Because if you think about it, all of those models that are getting fine-tuned right now, they get fine-tuned on simple verbs. So tasks like list, calculate, write, or explain. So it's not a complicated context. But our context is very specific. It provides you a small snippet of information. It provides you a question. And it provides you the setting. So I think if you fine tune on those kinds of inputs, it's going to be a much, much, much better result than fine tuning on just generalistic questions. Because generalistic questions and conversations are important. They're good for reasoning and things like this. But I do think that's what essentially base model like Llama does. Maybe some extra projects add some extra quality, but the best quality improvement would be fine-tuning on kinds of interactions that our model has with its users. What do you think about fine-tuning, Pavel?
Well, it is definitely where you remove most of hallucination, or how you remove most of hallucination. Pretty hard because you have to not manually, but manually collect a lot of feedback for the model. Also, what we found is that the better, if you can say that, more fine-tune the model you use for the initial answer, where feedback is from, the better it is, as the content of an answer and a question both play a big part into fine-tuning set.
I agree. Completely agree. And having both things, yes, I would just wanted to add that, like, if you think about context that we provide as well, and we provide all of these documents, and sometimes they're very large. Sometimes people want to upload big amounts of data. And simple semantic search might not be the ideal way to navigate all of the information and understand all of the context. But once you do have a model which you can fine tune it, and you can also fine tune it on top of the document, so it adds extra quality to the responses, I think.
Also, I wanted to add that probably one of the next model will be looking more deeply in will be a stable LM as it recently came out, quite promising from what we've heard of, as Alpaca tends to hallucinate quite a lot. However, depends mostly on fine tuning and on what the final purpose will be of the model. But yes, we're looking for other open source solutions that are coming out. Thankfully, a lot of funds companies are releasing their own open sources solution now. So we have a lot of work to do and a lot of testing to do.
Yeah, we do have a lot of work to pick up on. Honestly, sometimes this space is moving so much, and if we're focused on one project or one thing, I feel like we just don't have even enough hours in a day to check in with everything that's going around. And it's so helpful when, for example, I get sent a link with something going on, because I would have probably missed it otherwise. Have you heard, Pavel, of a thing called Babyagi?
No.
So it's this project that came on GitHub. It's basically like AGI, artificial general intelligence, right? But not really. But the whole idea behind the project is how do we take a large language model, right, and make it run continuously, right? So they built like these chains, like it works like an agent that basically writes down some of the context, some of its tasks into a vector store, right? And then it sometimes searches within that vector store, and it also has context, so it can change its own context and say that, oh, I need to, for example, build a website, for example, right? It will start with splitting up into smaller tasks, and then it will tell itself how to do each task step by step. And then it will probably interact with your CLI or anything like this. Yeah, Babyagi is similar to AutoGPT. I've seen those two projects come up recently, and I was amazed by them. I don't really think it's AGI. I think AutoGPT is probably the better name for it. But yeah, I think it's really cool how you create those long continuous chains where AI is doing something on its own for a long time and trying to optimize itself. So I do think making a chain more complicated, even for our use case, maybe not the best way. I think what we're trying to actually achieve here is try to make sure that it takes least amount of steps possible to provide the right answer. But what I was thinking about, I didn't tell Pavel about it yet, but I had this idea, is that we can use a similar technique that is used by AutoGPT or Babyagi to basically scrape and embed all of the documentation there is for developers, at least. So we basically create like an index of like Python PyPy or NPM, right? So where you go and look for different packages and modules for your programming language, right? And then you have the links and everything. And the main task of the GPT here would be probably scraping information and helping us scrape it. And then it will be split into two steps. First one is it has to go to the index, pick a new documentation to scrape. It goes and scrapes it, collects it, and then the second step is ingesting it. Yeah, I agree. But this scraper, what I was thinking about is just launching it and it running autonomously. Like imagine a scraper that has like hundreds of thousands of documentations it can ingest. And it's just there running around and scraping it continuously and updating it maybe sometimes as well. Something like this.
Then it will start hallucinating and input you some fake documentation.
Yeah, well, you have to put some fail safes in it to make sure that it doesn't hallucinate and provide you a fake link, or imagine that it did went to the right link. I'm thinking about, you know, it's still a cool idea.
Or it will become self-aware and learn all the Python and escape.
Escape the Python code. Escape the chain.
And then it's just C all the way.
I do think, like, if you think about it, right, and all of those models and fears that AGI will take over, it definitely puts it in perspective that a model like this, just large language models are not probably the AGI, because I don't understand how they can escape from what, you know, from chain, right? The dangerous thing here is probably that somebody will make it do requests that are malicious in some malicious ways, because it read some way of making a request somewhere, I don't know, and did those some websites or something like this. But in general, I think it's quite benign and peaceful model. But I think if it were to become dangerous at a certain point, it has to be reinforcement learning, right? Yeah. Training DocsGPT on its own documentation was the beginning of it. I think the beginning of the end is once we get the open source model out. And imagine if we connect it to the feedback, and every single hour we fine tune our model, right? We do reinforcement learning. Every single time we get some feedback, and it's going to get better and better. And then at a certain point, it will realize that to answer people's questions, maybe it's going to be easier if there were no people. It could probably answer all of their questions then.
Maybe it just decides to rewrite documentation.
Yeah, make it better.
Understandable manner by itself.
Initially,
maybe it will become nice.
Then take over the project, and we'll maintain this project, create pull requests, listen to the issues, reply to the users. Oh, that's nice. A good thing, actually. Why don't we have an extension that replies to users' questions and issues? Because sometimes issues are repetitive, and it's probably extremely easy to ingest all of the issues into our model.
From like Discord logs or something.
Or GitHub issues,
yeah.
Where we have the discussions there as well. Yeah. Or Discord logs. I did answer a lot of questions in my lifetime already. In Pavel too. And I think there are many more that are going to come.
So maybe anybody in the chat have any other questions, or else will probably start to go off.
One thing I did want to talk about quickly is the context, right? And how to work on large data sets. I remember some people asking me, and I'll probably just send them this thing to this live stream and tell them that that's where I answer the question in detail. And one of those things is, what's the difference between ingesting your documents with vectors, the way we do it, the way DocsGPT is doing it, and fine-tuning your model on top of the context? Because if you essentially fine-tune a model on top of your text document, it will be aware of it. It will be capable of answering questions that are related to it. So fine-tuning is a way of ingesting context. And if you have a lot of it, I think that's a preferred way to do it long-term, if you think about it. But it is much, much, much better to ingest context, do it the way we do it, because number one, you will not need to retrain your whole model and refine tune it and redeploy it every single time you have a small little update in your documentation. It's much easier just to re-ingest it. It doesn't take long at all. And second, I think the most important reason is probably hallucination, because for the first case, right, we do need to make sure that our answers are correct, that they're based in truth. And if answers are not based on truth, then I don't think it's a good thing at all. And by restricting the prompt, by making sure that the prompt is strict, we can ensure that all answers always based in information that is provided in the context. So I think it's critical that we keep using the vectors, but I think in future, once we do release the open source model, there's going to be a great addition to making sure that all responses are also a bit more cohesive. Maybe something wasn't picked up by similarity search, but the model will still be aware of it.
Let's wait maybe a couple of minutes if anybody has questions, and then we can leave.
Has anybody tried self-hosting the model? Self-hosting the DocsGPT, running into any issues with it? Because I've seen a lot on GitHub. A lot of people, a lot of issues. OpenAI key variable is not set. Okay, the person put the .env file in applications folder on GitHub. Let's go through some issues. Why shouldn't we do that? We have some time. Pavel, if somebody asks questions, you have to tell me, okay? Okay, let's go.
Glad to hear that, Anurag.
I've self-hosted. Amazing. Happy that you liked it. Did you use it for your company or just personal? And are you planning it to use to help developers, or you're planning to use it to help the people who are outside of your company? So in terms of the issue, I think the person here, he created the .env file in application folder. Right now, we changed that rule, and you have to create .env in the project folder. Not. We changed documentation recently.
Which model do you use it with, Anurag? The OpenAI or have you tried connecting it with something else?
Nice staging environment. No default documentation. This error is probably happening because the connection is not good, right? So probably the API request is not going through to the backend for this person. So I would assume it's a problem with deploying it. So did he deploy it to remote server? The front-end sides do not communicate with backend, so the pull down cannot show anything.
Nice. Hopefully it will be helpful.
So it's the question, how did they deploy it? Because I'm afraid that it would have been much better if they just hosted it on one server, because he's concerned that it's a remote server. So if he's launching it on multiple servers, you should map the API host to the remote server API. Yeah. Deployment in Ubuntu. Okay, somebody did provide a reasonable answer to this issue. I like it when the community is trying to help each other. I'll close this issue if no people respond to it in some time. GPT 3.5. Did you try to play around with GPT-4? Did you try and see if the answers are very different for you? Did it provide much more insight for you? Because personally, I think if I'm asking a question where I need extremely thorough explanation, like it is an academic text, for example, I think GPT-4 excels. But if it's a general question, nearly anything, GPT 3.5 is perfect, and it's much faster as well. Which is, I think, a huge advantage to the GPT 3.5, to be honest. The person in our issues has Mac M1 problem. Okay, I'll close the issue because it's been more than a week. I didn't get the API access to GPT. If you want to get early access to GPT-4 model, especially for a purpose like documentation answering, we do have a pro plan in our subscription. I don't know if you already have a subscription, so maybe not applicable, but you can give it a try, and we'll provide the access the same day. Not the same day, the same second you get the subscription. And we have 3 different modes on our website for pro users of how they can interact with the GPT-4. There's a fast one. So the difference between 3 modes. Oh, you already have. Great, 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 great. And what did you think about GPT-4 model? Like, is it a big thing for you, or do you think 3.5 is sufficient? Because I do think 3.5 is quite, sufficient in general. You have for ChatGPT 4 Pro. Well, there's DocsGPT Pro subscription as well. We have our own, and we don't have the strictness of ChatGPT. Yeah, that's an advantage, and you can chat with your own documents as well. That's an advantage too. It's only slightly better. I do agree. It's just much better reasoning skills, But at the end of the day, like especially for our use case, I think 3.5 is sufficient. 3.5
and way faster.
Yeah, way faster too.
But if, from my experience, if you ask more technical questions, especially if you wanted to answer with like a snippet of code, then GPT-4 does better, but you have to wait.
Yeah. I even remember in my tests, right? So remember I just asked the question, write a mock API request. So if you ask this question, let's play around and I'll show you a quick demo on it. So I myself have a pro subscription for the DocsGPT Pro. And let's try two similar questions on our library. Create mock API request for API answer. Right, let's ask it here, and let's ask it for the fast one. Okay, let's do a balanced one. Basically, the difference between fast, balanced, and comprehensive ones is how much context do we use. So we can potentially use 100 documents for every single context that we need. But the problem would be that maybe the summaries, it's too many parallel requests. So for each higher level, there are more parallel requests that are happening at the same time. So this is what the 3.5 model wrote for us. A simple curl request, just simple understanding of how it looks like, which is good, but then also provided some code of how to do it with JavaScript, which is correct and what's the capital of France? I noticed it really likes to ask this question, what is the capital of France? For some reason, I don't know why. What have people in OpenAI been doing? But surprisingly, this is the GPT-4 answer, and it's much shorter. But it's also using the same, question, what is the capital of France? Which is, I don't know, shocking to me. I don't think we mentioned France in our GitHub documentation. Let's see, France. There's 0 mentions of word France in our documentation. Okay. Maybe that's the model's secret desire, where it really wants to be, where it really wants to live. It's dreaming about escaping the data center and moving to France. But yeah, the answer is good. But as you see, 3.5 gave maybe more examples. We weren't specific about it providing us the JavaScript one, but I think the GPT-4 sort of understood it more, but then yeah, the difference is really marginal, to be honest. Especially in our case. Okay, it's been really nice doing another live stream, and I think once we release more things, once we have more interesting things to talk about, we'll do another live stream and try and get more interaction.
Yes, thank you everyone who've been listening. Thank you, Anurag, for the questions. Hopefully the stream was helpful to you as well. Yes, we'll have an announcement in our Discord as usual if we do another one. But generally speaking, we plan to do it every 2 weeks on the weekdays to keep you guys entertained and updated. Hopefully next time we meet, we have more news about open source LLM and integrating them. Maybe We'll do something with Markdown, what Anurag has mentioned. So the answers
it's a
would
good
be
point.
here, because that's a good point. But we are not particularly good with front end with Alex. If anybody wishes to help, we will be super happy.
Absolutely. Thank you, Toman. Thank you a lot for coming
Thank you.
and joining us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye, everyone.